Because it's the month of October and it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, my goal is to share with you and spread awareness on what domestic violence actually looks like, okay? So today I want to discuss what the domestic violence power and control wheel looks like. It's one of the most educational tools to understanding how abuse actually works. So the domestic violence wheel, the power and control wheel that I'm speaking of, was actually developed and created in the 1980s by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota. Researchers had interviewed over 200 survivors of domestic violence, and what they discovered was that physical abuse was actually just one spoke of this wheel, okay? The core of the whole wheel was control. So at the center of the wheel, it's the abuser's goal to maintain control over their victim, okay? So when looking at the wheel, there's actually 8 spokes or 8 categories that the researchers had discovered. And these 8 spokes are tactics that the abuser uses. And please know that each spoke actually, like all the tactics, are interconnected. The abuser rotates between each spoke as needed to dominate in the relationship. So the first spoke that the researchers identified that the abuser uses towards the victim is intimidation. This can look like the abuser just giving the victim looks, gestures, "Oh, you're gonna get it." This puts the the victim on notice that something bad is soon going to happen. So spoke 2 or category 2 is the abuser is using emotional abuse towards the victim, and their goal is to break down the self-worth of their victim. Okay, this looks like constant criticism, gaslighting them, mocking them, sarcasm, saying that they're joking about things but they're really not. The goal is they want their victim to lose confidence and to begin to only see the abuser's version of the story as truth. Okay? So spoke 3 or category 3 is the abuser wants to use isolation on their victim. So cutting off the victim's support and resources. What this looks like is the abuser will start to monitor the victim's phone calls, when they can talk to friends and family, okay? They begin to ask the victim, "Well, why are you going out with friends? Wouldn't you rather spend time to be with me? Why is your family coming over here?" And the abuser actually will end up taking the victim and moving far away to isolate them so much that the victim relies on their abuser for resources, for emotional support, and for survival. So the 5th spoke that the researchers discovered that abusers use is children, okay? So controlling the victim through the children's safety, needs, and of course, love. So what this can look like is the abuser threatens the victim by threatening to take the kids away, telling the children that, the victim doesn't love them, and then using parenting time as leverage to the victim, saying, "Well, if you behave, I'll let you see the kids." A really good movie from 1984 called The Burning Bed with Farrah Fawcett. She did an amazing job in this movie. That movie really describes how the abuser will use the children to manipulate and control the survivor. So if you get a chance, try to watch that movie. It's an excellent movie. But the abuser's goal is that the child is a tool that they use in their power dynamic. So the 6th category that the researchers discovered, or the 6th spoke, was there was definitely gender roles going on here. So, for example, if the abuser is the male and the victim is the female, the abuser will use male privilege, okay, acting as head of household, making all major decisions about the victim, expecting obedience and service, and treating the partner, the female, as inferior to them. The abuser's goal is that they want the survivor's autonomy and equality to be completely destroyed, and just replace that with subservience and fear. So the seventh spoke that the researchers discovered was economic/financial abuse. Okay. So what this looks like, the abuser wants to control like all the money, resources, and independence from, their victim. If they allow the victim to work, they'll take the victim's paycheck. They make the victim beg for, money just to justify like everyday purchases of like food and, toiletries and things for the kids. Even some abusers actually refuse to go to work, and they make their victims go work and like carry all the heavy burdens and stresses financially, plus on top of the household, chores and the children. So this really drains their victim. And a lot of abusers will hide the assets, possibly sabotage employment, and ruin credit. So the goal is to keep the victim financially dependent. Like it traps them to the situation and to the abuser. So the eighth spoke that the researchers discovered that abusers use towards their victims is coercion and threats. Threatening to harm, ruin, or expose the victim to enforce compliance. And what this can look like is threatening to harm them or their children or if they're animals, if they have animals. The abusers will also threaten like suicide, that they're going to, harm themselves to manipulate the victim. And then they also will use court filings, CPS reports, or police contact to intimidate the victim, okay? Saying like, you'll lose everything if you leave. I'm going to do this to you. And then also the abuser will, threaten to share like private information, because of course that's what they do. Abusers, the victim confides in the abuser, and then they end up using that information against them if they are not compliant with them. So the effect is that fear replaces choice, and that the survivor stays to protect themselves and their children. So number 9 is actually the outer rim of the power and control wheel. The outer rim involves the physical violence and sexual violence, okay? Abusers will force themselves, this can look like rape and be rape, but they force their victims to have sexual contact with them, and they purposely will not use protection. And this is called reproductive coercion, where they purposely want to impregnate their victim, because the pregnancy in turn ends up trapping their victim to them, okay? And then they end up having like power and control over their victim during the whole pregnancy. And they use this as a trap, and they also can use this as punishment to keep their victims tied to them. So alongside the domestic violence power and control wheel, researchers created a second wheel, and they call this the post-separation power and control wheel. And this is where the victim actually is able to leave and get away from the abuser. However, the abuser still will use power and control over their victims through the relationship involving children. And what this looks like is the abuser will file court filings and custody disputes to maintain power and control over the victim. The abuser will play like the concerned parent to the authorities. However, behind the scenes, they're doing it to undermine the victim. And then what the abuser will do, especially if the children are older, like teenagers, they will control the narrative or the child's perception by saying, well, if it wasn't for, the victim, we would be able to still be together, and they'd be, I'd be able to see you, and we'd have a really good relationship. The power and control wheel reminds us that domestic violence is not about anger, and it's not about like loss of temper. It's about intentional control and entitlement. Healing begins when we name the abuse for what it is and hold the abusers accountable for their tactics. This in turn will empower the survivors to reclaim their safety and dignity and their self-determination in life.